So the Rockets lost Trevor Ariza this offseason. He was a pivotal piece for them in nearly beating the Warriors, and sure, he may have missed a million shots in that Game 7, but his defense and shooting before that game was still a huge thing for them. And I think they're going to have to replace him at some point this season. They've already attempted it with two guys, one being Carmelo Anthony, who, as we all know, was not very good for the Thunder last season, especially on defense. So while I think he could give them some more offensive pop, I would be surprised if he ended up being actually better than Ariza for the Rockets. And the second one is James Ennis, who, I could see him being within a similar mold of Ariza, but I don't think he's going to be as good on defense for that to really be a thing. So they're probably going to have to trade for the guy, or maybe it would end up being a buyout. But if it was going to be a trade, I do think they have some assets. One is Ryan Anderson, who, yeah, he's overpaid and then some, but he's only got 2 years left, and if you attached a draft pick to him, then I think a team that's not trying to win right now would gladly take him on. And then you've also got a smaller expiring in Gerald Green, and what helps here, as I mentioned, draft pick. Houston somehow has all of their first-round picks moving forward, which is really difficult to do when you're as good as they are. But anyway, let's get to the names. First one's Kent Bazemore of the Atlanta Hawks, who his contract is not that long at this point. He has a player option, which we expect him to accept. I'll be honest, I think the idea of Ken Bazemore is a little better than Bazemore himself, just because sometimes I think he loses focus on both sides of the floor. Sometimes his defense, at least off the ball, can be maybe a little rough where he can lose an assignment or whatever. But I do think he's still pretty decent. One thing we have to remember is if you're going to get moved to the Rockets, then you're going to be asked to do things that maybe you weren't asked to do as much on other teams. Like, he'll switch way more on Houston, whereas on Atlanta, I don't know if that's always the case. But another thing is he would get the easiest shots of his career. So while sometimes I think he does a little too much on offense, like maybe he'll try to ISO or he'll try to run a pick and roll a bit more times than he should, he'll also just have easier looks if he were to be traded to the Rockets. So I don't love Bazemore for them, but I think it's not a bad option. I think a better one would be DeMarre Carroll, who kind of resurrected his career in Brooklyn because, well, he had some injury troubles with the Raptors, and when he was in there, he was not himself from his Atlanta Hawk days. But he's been pretty legit for Brooklyn. He's been bouncier on offense, initiating his own plays sometimes. And when he's asked to do the role player stuff, he's able to do it pretty effectively. And I think he would be similar to Ariza for them in that, because of his height and his smarts and strength, he could defend quite a few positions between point guard and power forward. I don't think he can guard everyone who fits into that criteria, but he can defend a decent amount of guys, and he would definitely help you against the Warriors, which is the big thing for the Rockets, of course. And then offensively, I think Carroll is smart enough to just kind of float around, and I don't think he minds only putting up maybe like 5 points in a game. That's another reason why I like him more than Bazemore, is that I think Baze would maybe not love being the, fifth guy in the offensive hierarchy of the Rockets or whatever, whereas I think Carroll would be totally fine with it. So a good fit, and he's on a 1-year contract, so I mentioned buyouts earlier. Maybe the Nets would end up just buying him out. I don't think so, because I feel like they'd want to get something back for him, and if you placed some protections on that first-round pick, then I think Brooklyn would jump all over that one. I love Danny Green. I'll admit that he is perhaps starting his decline, but with that being said, the Spurs were awesome defensively, last season and the many years before that. And he was a huge reason for that, right? Being maybe the best transition defender in the NBA, and then being so disciplined there as well, where he knows the assignment, he's always going to execute it, he's never going to go outside of himself, and he's also a very good on-ball defender as well. Now, this would be dependent on the Kawhi Leonard situation going really poorly, and the Raptors being a disappointment, and then they would move Danny because he's on a 1-year deal, and all that stuff. But if this goes well, the Kawhi Leonard situation, that is, then Danny would probably be on the Raptors for the whole season, and they would potentially consider re-signing him. I mean, I don't know, the age is a thing, but he's a good player. The three-point shooting, the very good defense, Houston, I'm sure, would love to have him. Now we can explore a team and a trade that I think was talked about a little bit like a week ago, which was Ryan Anderson for Marvin Williams, and I think Michael Kidd-Gilchrist was even in there as well. The Hornets have themselves a couple of good wings who can defend a few positions, one of those being Marvin, of course, who has really improved his game ever since small ball fours became a thing. If this were to happen, and I think it would involve Ryan Anderson being in the move, then I think it would probably come like mid-season when the Hornets knew whether they were bad or not. Because if they were still bad, and then that opens up the idea of Kemba Walker being out, then they would want to get that first-round pick from Houston, but I could also see Charlotte not wanting to do that because Anderson actually makes more money than Marvin Williams does, and if they believe they can keep Kemba, then you don't want to drive up your salary even more. There's also Nicolas Batum, who I think when it comes to a 3-and-D player doesn't totally fit into what Houston would want, but I think it could also be kind of creative because he might be the most versatile offensive player of everybody talked about in this video, and I'm sure there's other players that Houston's looking at that I'm not going to talk about here, but I would bet that Batum could be even a little better offensively than all those guys because he can go off the dribble, grab rebounds, make plays for others and all that. Charlotte's interesting. I mean, they've got a lot of decent players who are just waiting to get moved the second this season goes south. We'll go to the Pistons now with Reggie Bullock, who made them quite a bit better when he was playing for them, and he's the cheapest option of everybody here. He only makes $2 million a season, and he's only got 1 year. So this would be like a Gerald Green contract swap, pretty much. You might have to throw in some like second-round projections in there, if I can say the word projections correctly. You also wouldn't have to move a first, and that's a nice thing. And then finally, Avery Bradley, who's got about 2 years left on his deal. Definitely fits the bill on defense. Although you could argue that he's too short to guard the likes of Kevin Durant and all that, but he definitely gives Steph Curry fits. And I think him being on a team where he's not asked to do as much on offense and defense could probably be pretty damn good for him. So those are a whole lot of names, and once again, there's probably other guys who I just didn't think of. Houston's pretty damn good, but I do think they got worse with the loss of Ariza. I think they got to make some moves.